Welcome to this edition of FREESPEAK, a podcast of the Namibia Media Trust, and I'm Gwen Lister. And today I have with me here Frederico Links. He is the author of a paper on fake news and Namibian elections, and it is the first in the series by the Institute for Public Policy Research in their Democracy Report, Namibia Votes 2019 series. And we're here today to discuss the report a little bit. Frederico, welcome. And I think we should probably start out by defining this concept. Fake news is an expression I don't use, and I quite honestly refer to it as the F word. I noticed that in your report you've mentioned this, knowing there is controversy about this term, and you have put the word in inverted commas throughout the report for that very reason. The UNESCO report on the same subject basically puts a strike through fake news. So, Frederico, disinformation, misinformation, I'm sure people are confused. So we need to just really look at this in very basic terms. If a newspaper makes a mistake with the title of someone or a factual error and apologizes the next day, how do we define that? And how do you distinguish that from a lot of what is on the internet, which is absolutely intentionally designed to fool people or propagandize people by means of absolute lies, really, which people believe? How can they discern between these things?
I'd say, disinformation, I think we're on the same page on this, is out and out designed to cause harm. Mm-hmm. And harm, what we mean by harm would be to intentionally...
I think intent is the key word.
Intentionally sort of confuse a discussion or the informational issue that is being addressed, and to create confusion.
Right.
Whoever accesses that information. And in some places, it's even meant to. It's cost people lives in places like India and Nigeria and so on, where because of disinformation, intentional, it has fueled ethnic tensions. It has fueled religious tensions. It has caused deaths.
I don't have an example here.
But in Namibia, in Namibia, we see this especially around sort of the inflaming of passions around ethnic identities, tribalism and ethnic nationalism, which we see. And if you go on Facebook, for instance, and you have these discussion groups, you very quickly get the sense that people go into their ethnic silos and retreat into their ethnic identities.
Okay, but Frederico, let's come up with an example in traditional media, i.e. print or radio, and on the other hand, one on social media.
Yeah.
Give us an example of disinformation, which is deliberate, in those two different contexts.
On social media, as I said, the disinformation around tribal realities. In traditional media, we've seen recently. Just taking an example of the IPPR, and it concerned the Ondangwa by-election, where a headline in one of the weekly newspapers was intentionally crafted to convey the message that IPPR director Graham Hopwood said that the independent candidate was favourite to win. And if you read the story itself, it wasn't true. But you could clearly see, and attempts were made to get a correction out of the publication, and they simply
refused to do so.
Yeah.
But the story didn't misrepresent him, but the headline did.
But the headline. So you had a very clear misrepresentation of what the person actually said, and that is intentional. And it was clear that it was intentional. And it was clear because of the sort of leanings that the specific political leanings that this sort of publication has sort of demonstrated. So you have these sorts of things, and that was intentional. On social media, the intent, we have some platforms where some of them are sort of political party associated.
Well, if it comes to political parties, we're not really talking disinformation there, we're talking propaganda most of the time, because obviously party spokespeople
but this is
want
not,
to...
But this is not, this is an associate. It's not the political party itself. Where on Facebook and WhatsApp, some very ugly messages were, for instance, sent out about the former cabinet minister Pintukeni Vulaitana by a certain individual that is sort of on the fringes of senior ruling party politicians, and it's all in the paper. I mean, I provide these examples there. So you have these very, very vitriolic, very poisonous posts on WhatsApp and on Facebook, leaking onto Twitter, where statements are being made and they're being shared further by others. And this is some people would say that the defining feature in some of the research, the defining feature is not so much the content of what we consider fake news. It is actually the virality, the speed and the mode and the distance it travels. That is the defining. That is what should be considered the defining feature of this phenomenon. And I agree with that. Social media gives it, and the algorithms are such that
obviously gives it greater push. It's not though it's a new phenomenon. Any of this is old as history itself, but it's just found more resonance, and it's faster than the speed of light. Because I was going to say, even something like the reference you make to Pintukeni, in ordinary parlance, before the rise of disinformation, the F word and so on, would have been defamation. You would have defamed her by making those comments about her. So, I mean, we haven't got the time to go into the in-depth discussion of all these things, but just, I think that gives people an idea of what really, and how to distinguish between something that is disinformation or misinformation or an absolute lie.
Another example. I mean, if you look at what happened before in the run-up to and during the SWAPO's, the ruling party's elective Congress of 2017, November 2017, and the sort of the countering disinformation campaigns that were running then. You had two camps. You had these two campaigns. One was breaking news, and the other one was this reporter. And these two were just sort of battling it out on WhatsApp and for misinforming not just the delegates that were going to the SWAPO Congress, but also anybody who had access to these groups and was interested in politics, and they spilled onto various groups on other social media platforms. So these were very visible, very clear disinformation campaigns, which were aimed at smearing and tarnishing the opposing camps, Team Harambee and Team SWAPO, that were contesting for power at that point in the ruling party.
Yes. There's also, I mean, it's not local, but the very famous example of something that might well have influenced an election, and that was the fake news, as they call it, of Hillary Clinton, who was alleged to be running a trafficking ring out of a pizza parlor. And it went absolutely viral. And I mean, again, it's very difficult to tell whether Trump got thousands more votes simply because of that story aimed to discredit Clinton. So clearly it can have a very great influence on an election outcome at times.
I mean, and it's disturbing to... I mean, we always have the sense that it's always people who are informationally illiterate and informationally underexposed, and people who aren't all that... lack of a reading culture,
unsophisticated, and
sort of unsophisticated media consumers who are the primary spreaders and the primary audiences of fake news and misinformation and disinformation, propaganda, and all these other phenomena. But just this week, actually, I mean, a report on a study in Indonesia came out where actually there's a great deal of fake news, and what it points to, a sizable proportion of highly educated people are also susceptible and also spreading this information. So it's not just that we can say, it's those people who don't know nothing, poor educated, they don't read, they don't have a reading culture, they don't know. And if I look at, for instance, this got me to look at, for instance, my WhatsApp groups. And I have like one where there are a lot of professionals on, and just the amount of information that is questionable that gets shared on, for instance, on one of these groups is amazing. And these are all educated people with high positions in the organizations where they are and in their professional fields. And the amount of misinformation and disinformation and just...
And maybe compounding all that is that people often, especially those online, are seeking to reinforce their own prejudices.
Exactly.
So something they may read, even if it is later disproved, will go much further than the actual correction or the revealing of the truth at the end of the day. So it is very dangerous and leading to the dumbing down of the world, because we all know information and good information is key for citizens to make good decisions about their lives, and the less access they have to such good information and internalize rubbish, basically, really will lead to the dumbing down of the world rather than the contrary in building a knowledge-based society. It's so important that people understand that what they read and the kind of news and information they consume, for want of a better word, it's so essential that they try to verify and before they just believe anything they read.
Yeah, but we want to avoid a situation, I think mostly, where we give scope to politicians, especially politicians in your more authoritarian-minded jurisdictions, to define it for us. Because they invariably, I mean, we're already seeing this on the African continent, where you have these anti-fake news laws in some countries where it becomes free speech violating, where it becomes a blanket under which countering fake news becomes a blanket under which
any dissenting views are
legitimate political expression is suppressed, is oppressed and suppressed. So you don't want that sort of situation. And I think that is why there is such a, why there is at the moment, if you look at the academic and sort of media literature around this phenomenon of fake news, why people are trying to come up with an acceptable universal definition that can speak to all contexts, and can address all the concerns both of your ordinary person, your academic, and your government official, so that we do not allow a situation where under some blanket term people, human rights are being violated. And I think this is also where David Kay, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression, he's also waded into this and tried to caution against fake news being used to suppress legitimate political expression and violate all sorts of human rights.
Exactly. Frederica, the other thing you do say in the report is that this is really a first phase to monitor and map the phenomenon of the F word and disinformation during the Namibian election process. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you plan to do there.
Yeah, I mean, so we have established, or we're in the process of establishing the Social Media Tracking Center, where we want to actually see the sorts of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda that and hate speech that emerges in the run-up to the November 2019 elections in Namibia. And we're already seeing a lot of, what would be considered sort of fake news on social media, politically motivated and politically sort of associated.
Where is it most prolific when we talk about social media?
I mean, if you look at the social media stats, I mean, Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp are the biggest in Namibia. Facebook is still the biggest social media platform, and a lot of what you see on Facebook gets shared onto Twitter and onto WhatsApp, or vice versa, from WhatsApp onto Facebook and Twitter and so on. So you have this sort of social media symbiosis, way of creating a fake news ecosystem. And this is, we sort of get a sense, I mean, I don't have any proof for this, but we sort of get a sense that there's a steady increase in this throughout this year. And that a lot of it has to do with internal ruling party politics. And factionalism, and then there's the, of course, the ugliness of tribalism and all these things, and then there's some borderline incitement and hate speech and so on. So this is all busy happening. So what we want to do, and we'll produce another report after this project. So early next year, in late January, we'll be launching that report, where we will sort of give the data and what it looked like in the run-up to the elections. So this one is basically a scoping. This paper is basically a scoping report. I did a scoping study to set the scene.
Exactly.
And then at the end of the project in late January, we'll then release a report and do a presentation and so on about what it actually looked like ahead of the elections, and whether it actually is such a big problem as it has turned out in elections in other parts of the continent and the world, whether fake news is actually such a big concern for us in our political and electoral landscape.
Okay. Frederica, I also think, we talk about this subject a lot, and it is the sort of flavor of the day, if you like, all over the world, vis-a-vis media. Now, your ordinary listener might say, well, look, what does it really matter at the end of the day if I read some of these things that are untrue or lies or propaganda? How is it going to change things? And specifically when we look at elections, what are we worried about here? Is it something that is going to change, or it can change the outcome of the election? Maybe a few words on that.
There's no, even if you look at, it might not change the outcome of the election, but it does pollute your political discourse. It does pollute your commons, where people meet to discuss. And social media has become the commons, where people meet to discuss pertinent societal issues and so on, political issues, and especially in the run-up to elections and so forth. In Namibia, it's not that, I don't think it's that big yet. Yeah. Penetration rates and internet use is not all that high. I think it's about a quarter of the population. But it's still an important space. And if you look at some of the comments on some of the posts, how people have been triggered, and for instance, a lot of the tribalist and ethnic nationalist statements, you can just see how that sort of engagement sours people's views of each other in society. So it's not that it's just if I read it, so what? Yeah. If you share it, and even parody content, like sort of satirical content, stuff that isn't meant to be taken serious. The literature suggests, the research that has been done in other parts of the world suggests that there are actually people who believe such content and then pass it along to others in their groups who might also believe it. Yes. So even if it's a small fraction of people who believe, say, a joke about and take it seriously, there still are people who do that, and then this thing spins out of control, and we wonder, how is it that people didn't see the funny in it?
Exactly. And take it seriously.
Did somebody actually believe this?
Yeah.
And this is happening.
Okay. And ultimately, it doesn't only affect elections; it can impact democracy and human rights.
All sorts of things.
Exactly. Frederica, just to go on to another question, one of the points you raise, which I'm not sure I absolutely agree with, but I'd like to hear your points, and that is, you seem to attribute the phenomenon of the F word or disinformation largely to what you refer to as declining journalistic standards. Now, I know, and we all know, that traditional media, as we know, newspapers, radio, television, are in a fight for survival and for sustainability, and that definitely standards have declined. But to make that the cause, or the main cause for the proliferation of fake news, which is primarily on social media. How do you come to that conclusion?
Okay, I don't make that the main cause. I'm just sort of using a template that was developed by First Draft, which is an international project that aims to map and counter the spread of fake news and so on. And they start off with poor journalism, and I just use the same template. But I mean, as a journalist myself, I mean, it resonated with me, and it's one of the things that I'm very concerned about. Declining media standards and declining trust in media, because it affects my work as well. And if you look at the literature and the research that has been done around declining trust in media and so on, you'll see that one of the factors that is always placed high is how people view the media as not credible. And this is because of audience confusion through how stories are reported and so forth. And media capture plays a big role, where people start viewing certain media organizations are allied to certain political interests or political movements or so on, or speak from a certain political perspective.
When there are clear ownership agendas, which the reader may not know about.
I mean, so media capture is part of the problem.
Okay.
And the pushing of certain agendas. And then you have things like, I mean, that we see a lot in Namibia as well, where you have, and this has come out in research in other countries as well, where you have media organizations publishing corporate PR in newspapers as if it's editorial content.
Correct.
And that's what people point to and say, that's fake news. That's not journalistic content.
Yeah. And that increases the distrust.
So people see corporates publishing this thing, and even the corporate byline and a corporate official's face there, and that's what people in, for instance, the US and other places have pointed to.
Yeah,
that's fake news. That's sort of stuff. You see, so we have that sort of problem. This PR journalism, this press release driven journalism. That's what people point to. The public points to and say that's fake news.
Exactly,
and they have a point.
Yeah. So we're really looking at the necessity to up professionalism in journalism, which at the end of the day, good journalism is probably the best antidote to this disinformation, and hopefully that people can be guided in that direction and away from clickbait. I mean, that's important.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not just the one thing. I mean, it's also on online, clickbait headlines, clickbait advertising on credible newspapers or media organizations' websites. All sorts of things, tabloidization, sort of sensationalizing in headlines and intros and stories, all sorts of things, So, and also, I mean, a general decline in depth and context in reporting.
Yeah.
And I mean, so all these contribute to a decline in trust in the media, a decline in people turning to what we consider as reputable sources of information, and so forth, and people start seeing the media only out as trying to make a buck, trying to survive by broadcasting clickbait. And so on. It's a range of factors.
So also, I think, sometimes we think, and there are stats out there to show that more and more people hopefully are turning to more reputable sources of news and information, given the sort of tsunami of disinformation out there. And obviously we hope that's something that continues. At the end, Frederico, as we wind up on this, it looks to me like combating disinformation, misinformation, lies and propaganda really requires a multifaceted approach. There's no silver bullet solution. Would you agree with that? I mean, media literacy, all these kind of things come into play.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. You can't just have the one thing. It has to be a range of interventions from a range of actors. It has to be at educational level, where from in your school curriculums you have to deal with issues around information and information sophistication and how people access and interpret information and what sort of information. So it's media literacy from school level. It's civil society engagement with ordinary people. It's the media being proactive in
doing the good stories and the real stuff.
And also doing advocacy around what is credible information and not just publish and pray. That people think you're producing quality. No, there needs to be a step beyond. And actually, research shows that way. The publish and pray, what that used to be the position, it isn't persuading people.
Yeah,
there needs to be more from more actors to
really conquer this thing. Yeah,
sort of the pollution of information landscapes, and especially the news information landscape. Right. So there has to be a range of acts, and we specifically spoke to the issues around elections in this paper.
Correct. But
and we want to make it clear we're not calling for dealing with this phenomenon in a broader context.
Yeah.
In a very narrow electoral context, regulating how political actors and political parties and all the associated support and so on, the sort of statements they make from platforms and media on social media and in news media, that they act civilly and not just be shouting matches where they just lob lies and propaganda at each other, and treat the public with respect.
Exactly.
And treat our elections with respect. It's an important political and democratic process.
Right.
Let's treat it with respect.
Right. And at the end of the day, Frederica, I guess it's really, dear listeners out there, it's really up to you on your own to be more discerning about your news and information sources, and hopefully by accessing your report, again, people becoming more conscious of this phenomenon. And after all, I think most people don't really like to be fooled. So if they are more discerning, this is the way forward on that. So please get a copy of that report. And Frederica, thank you very much for joining us on this first edition of FreeSpeak.
Thank you very much for having me, Gwen.
Thank you.